everybody, to the CURE panel from the Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm Sadie, Otte. I'm one of the CTL faculty co-directors and also organic chemistry lab coordinator at the Keck Science Department. So before the panelists introduce themselves, I wanted to get a quick poll from the audience and see kind of where you're all at when it comes to cures. So how many of you feel like you have a good understanding of what a cure is? So most of you, okay, that's great. And how many of you have done a cure before or something like it? Good. That is really helpful. Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to go over like the definition a little bit first because I think it's still evolving and not necessarily something that everyone has the same understanding of, but it is different from inquiry-based or even project-based learning in a few ways. So for one thing that people generally agree on is that there's a discovery aspect to a cure where the outcome is unknown. In addition, there are scientific practices, so students think about hypotheses, they think about the literature, like what's been done, what is the current state of the field, and what can they do to kind of push that boundary. The work is in some way broadly relevant or important, so it's authentic, it's actually being used in some sort of wider study, not simply just done for its own sake. And ownership, that students feel ownership over the project and responsible or accountable for the things that they're producing in some way. So again, not everyone may agree on all of those things, but that's just kind of an idea of kind of where most people are landing with cures. So now, I'd love it if each panelist could introduce themselves in 5 minutes or less, and then we'll open it up for questions. If you want to just start handing it down, that'd be great.
So my name is Leconte. I'm in Keck Science in chemistry. I'm a biological chemist, so most of the things I've worked on have been sort of at that interface between biology and chemistry. I'll try to keep this short because I'd rather have lots of time for questions. So I'll just say my experiences with cures when I was reflecting on this were really varied. So when I was an undergraduate, I had a class that was an advanced chemistry lab class that was a cure. So I took it as a student, and then I TA'd it, which was actually maybe one of the most useful experiences I had as an undergraduate. And then when I came here, and those were like 3 of the 4 criteria. So I was listening to the criteria. I was like, was it a cure? 3 out of 4 things were checked off. And then when I came here, I've taught in our interdisciplinary biology and chemistry class. And so I created an interdisciplinary cure for first-year students. And in that, we were basically just doing some simple enzymology, where students would pick an amino acid, they change to alanine, and make some measurements on how that changed the function of the enzyme. And then I've started a class more recently that's a sort of bigger project-focused class where we're trying to use sort of direct evolution methods and identify novel proteins with new function. And that's an upper-level biochemistry majors class.
I'm Sara Olson. I'm in the Pomona biology department. And I didn't have any cures when I was an undergrad. I'm jealous that you got that chance. But when I was transitioning from my postdoc to my faculty position, I recognized the importance of keeping the research program going during the academic year. And also, of course, the main objective, right, keeping students engaged. And so I just started integrating from my first year here. I've been here 11 years now. But just put my research project into my advanced cell biology class. So I've been doing it 11 years. I've never taught the same lab twice. Every year it's been different, and it depends on the trajectory of where the research project is going in my research lab. So it's an advanced cell biology course for 24 students. So I have them split into 2 lab days. So 12 and 12. We run about 8 different projects through the semester. And the thing that stays the same, right? I don't want it to make it sound like we have to reinvent the wheel every year. It's not quite like that, right? We keep the same foundational experimental techniques every year. So they learn how to do microscopy, fluorescence microscopy, and co-immunoprecipitation, and Western blotting, and gene inhibitions, and things like that. So they learn the same techniques, but the focus, the research idea changes every year, depending on what the lab is doing. And so even when we're learning common techniques, the students, each group will have a different protein that they're studying. So some years, like I introduced the proteins that we discovered the year prior, right? And we want to learn more about them. Some years, the students will hunt through the literature, right, and hunt through the databases and try to decide what protein they want to study. And so it, kind of just varies year to year depending on where I kind of want to take the project. So I provide the big picture overview, and then the students are the ones that are designing what the individual projects will go. But I love the creativity that goes into it. I love the independence and the feeling ownership over the project that they have. More recently, we put CRISPR into the lab, so it's been kind of fun. We get to teach CRISPR, and everybody gets to choose their own edit and how to do things. But I guess I'll leave it for there now. Yeah, make time for questions. It's a lot of fun.
My name is Sheung. I am a physicist at Keck Science. I would say that definitely I did not take a CURE as an undergrad. I tried multiple times to incorporate different aspects of the definition that Sadie was talking about into different classes. So my first attempt was when I was a lecturer at the University of Illinois after my PhD. I took over a module in the advanced biophysics lab and had 4 students try to build on top of a teaching journal article. So there's a discovery aspect, but also some scaffolding up to that point. And then later on here, the stable class I'm teaching, I would say it's not quite a CURE, more like a very project-heavy class, is the electronics lab, where they definitely have a sense of ownership of a project that has like a month of in-class time for them to come up with their own idea of what they want to build using the knowledge in the field of different electronic circuits and different devices that we will redesign, but apply it to their day-to-day life. And so there's some discovery aspect to that, but I would say it's not scientific. And then another thing I've recently done is I kind of collaborating with a collaborator who's also an RUI, and we were trying to do something where we introduced like current research into their advanced physics lab, where I was the person supplying data, in my case microscopy videos. We were doing some tracking of DNA to look at how they are transported through an intracellular environment. And so that was where I would say in order to do it in physics, we have to either choose for them to do analysis only or do the taking data only. It's pretty hard to do both together, so I'm still thinking about that problem. And I'm generally just thinking about a way to make it a stable component of a class I'm about to launch, which is the Advanced Physics Lab here at Keck. Yeah, so I'm happy to discuss and hear ideas.
Yeah, I'm Dave Vosburg. I'm an organic chemist at Harvey. Been there since 2005. And I guess I did, in retrospect, do something kind of CURE-like as an undergrad in advanced organic lab. I did have one where it was a kind of coherent project that we all had different aspects to it. It was making new molecules that no one had made before. So I did that, I guess. Well, that's probably more modest than what I'm doing now. So when I came to in our second semester organic chemistry lab, which is essentially now it is a sophomore spring course, the second half of the course is students can make kind of whatever. And when I came, that was the case, but it was just like, go find a paper, go make a thing, as long as it's not illegal or too expensive or super dangerous, like go for it. But then it's like, then you have product and then you just throw it away at the end. It's like, this is perhaps not the best. And so after maybe 2 years or so, I started to say, well, actually, here's a molecule I want. And so how about somebody tries to make that? Here's the molecule that she wants. How about we try to make that or whatever? And sometimes like, this is a project that might work and it might not. Like, if this works, for a student for 5 weeks, then maybe I would actually commit a regular research student to it. But it's a low commitment of 1 out of, say, 5 to 12 students in a section of lab to just try it out for a while. So they kind of get to do that. It is very chaotic because they're all doing different things. None of it I've ever done before, almost entirely. And again, they're all different, and they give presentations. They're totally different than each other. Multiple papers have come out, like JChemEd articles mostly. But then like 5 different thesis students, their projects came out of something that started in this kind of venue. And a couple of hope for papers soon out of that, in addition to sort of chemical education stuff. So it's super interesting and fun. You kind of try out a student that might be a researcher in your group down the road, especially with their sophomores or used to be juniors for us. It's like, oh, if they're really productive there, it's like, hey, you want to continue on either this or something like this? We have, this is where to do it. So that's been a lot of fun and exciting. And Spencer's about to jump into this too this semester because we're starting like this coming week. They proposed a project. And we have, also I will note that one thing that I did is start to specifically say, here's some recommended projects. You don't have to choose from this list, but these are projects that I care about. You can pick something else if you really want to, but these I care about, and it might, I will work a little harder to help you with these ones if you versus your own is sort of how I kind of pitch it. So But it's been a lot of fun. It's my most exciting part of the semester for sure, and their presentations at the end are super interesting. And so yeah, but you know, and they don't have to, just showing up to the lab each day those weeks, it's like, all right, what's going to happen today? I have no idea, right? Hopefully not a fire, but you know, that's kind of how it goes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Torr. I've been here for about a year and a half in Keck Science. I'm the Integrated Sciences Lab Director. And prior to that, I was at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts for 19 years, something like that. I started teaching in 2002, pretty much fresh out of graduate school at Hampshire College. And in those days, we didn't call them cures. I don't know who the lucky person was who coined the sort of acronym and that publication, but that's just how we taught. That was basically, a cure is basically the pedagogy of Hampshire College. All the science courses were taught that way. And so I didn't know another way. I just stepped in, they said, this is what we do, and that's what I did. It turns out that it's a great way to teach. It's a great way to teach science. And so I've kind of been doing it all along. I've been doing it for first year students. I've done it for more advanced students, small classes, large classes. Courses that have been more field-based. So I'm a microbiologist, environmental microbiologist by training. Some courses have been more field-based, some purely lab-based. And you know, I feel like I've met my people up here because everything everybody has said has sort of resonated, although I have not personally experienced great success at publishing in journals with cures, but the success of students has been remarkable. We have done poster presentations at conferences, things like that. But in particular, I find them to be excellent places for students to find a place in science, discover that, oh, I can do science, and there's a place for me here. And to go on, so it's a great hook, and they go on, and they'll be great thesis students in many cases. And I've had students who have come to college, and I have to take a science course, but I'm an art major, and then discover, no, I love science. And it's really a result of, I think, the nature of the cure, where they get to dig in and actually, it's not science the way they did science in high school. It's science the way we do science, right? It's the way it's actually done. And so I think it has these tremendous strengths. So I'm continuing to try and do that here. I'm teaching the lab sections, or coordinate the lab sections of IBC. And one other aspect of, I'm not sure if it came up or not, if anybody else has mentioned it, but it's always been a priority for me working with students is that we take on projects that have a broader context, that are important in the world, that maybe an environmental problem, a problem that people care about and that affects people. So right now, we're doing a project, and I'm working with Katie. We're kind of collaborating across Advanced Chem Lab and IBC to look at problems in water, in drinking water, particularly in underserved communities, and so the students are working on that problem in the context of both biology and chemistry, but it's very much a cure. It's a little bit more mentored at the introductory level than it would be at the advanced level, but it's still a cure. So I can say more, but I'm sure there are questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated getting that little bit of introduction to what each of you do. And I would really like to make this conversational, so if anyone has questions, feel free to jump in. Maybe I'll take the first question, but really, anytime that you want to participate as the audience, or if panelists want to respond to each other, I'm totally open to that as well. So I guess for a little bit more, going deeper into what some of you have already touched on, which would be some of the benefits of doing a cure. If each of you could talk a little bit more about how you decided to do a cure, how you got interested in it, and how your learning outcomes change when you do a cure, and if you had to make trade-offs and why you felt that was worth it, or if you feel it's worth it, and why. And maybe we can start with Sara this time, so we mix it up.
In terms of changing learning outcomes, I didn't have to change anything because I've only done it this way. So it's not like I went from a traditional lab to a cure lab. But when I'm seeing the difference in learning outcomes between maybe the introductory class, which I teach, right, but the lab for that, which is more kind of structured and guided versus this one, which is more CURE-like, or which is a CURE. The learning goals and outcomes are roughly the same, right? It's like to explore the literature, to be able to mine the literature, to identify an unknown question, to develop a hypothesis, to design your experiments, and to test them, and to analyze the data. Like, those learning outcomes don't change. The idea of presentation of that data, right? The oral presentations we have, the poster presentations, writing a research proposal, like, that's all identical actually between the two different courses. It's just the idea of excitement, and I'm actually doing research that nobody knows the answer to, right? There's a lot more engagement from the students when they know that I don't know the answer, and that they know that they're the first person that's ever going to discover this. There's just a lot more investment that way rather than, okay, I'm just going through the motions and checking off the box. So that would be my opinion, is that, like, I don't really change the learning outcomes. That would, what else was there? I think that was the main thing.
That was the main thing.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I definitely, in physics, the typical way advanced lab is taught is it's little modules where students are shown or are asked to reproduce seminal experiments. For example, melting overdraft, or like the speed of light, or things like that. And so for me, being trained to teach in that way, I really did have to think a lot about how to change that grading rubric, and is it worth the time and effort? So I can say that for me, and I'm very much come up the side of, I definitely want to teach a CURE when I'm controlling the lab. And it's because within physics, I don't know how many of you are familiar with like the material we cover in physics, but basically there's like the cosmic mechanics, which is like apples falling and planets going, and then electricity, magnetism. And then there is statistical mechanics, which is like the gases and the fluids. And then there's like, quantum mechanics, which is the tiny stuff, right? And when an undergraduate student goes through a physics program, they will often, until like the first 3 years, they will maybe have spent maybe 2 weeks of the first 3 years on anything that enters the 20th century, right? Because they learn about Newton, they learn about like Lagrange, Laplace, whatever, and by the time they get to Einstein, that's 1905, right? And that's the stuff people think is mind-blowingly complicated. And so the fundamental, I guess, gap I wanted to address with the CURE is students I talk to, like majors that already have a physics degree or about to get a physics degree, they feel like the physics they learned come out of a book and it's dead. And they don't question the equation they read in the book, right? It's not a concept that it might be wrong. And the only way I've come up with that I can address this is to introduce like current research somehow. And in physics, the laboratory environment is the best way to do it, And so, and then just to briefly go over the rubric, I personally feel very strongly that it's unfair to grade students on anything that has a chance of luck involved. And so when it's something that even I don't know what the outcome will be, right? Obviously, I can't grade them on the outcome. Whereas it's very easy to lean back on that on a lab that, was done 200 years ago and was like a Nobel Prize or whatever. That oh yeah, you should have gotten the charged electron is, this, right? But when it's a CURE-like project or like a really very free-form project, like I'm teaching electronics lab, I've had to carefully look at my rubric and ask myself, how much am I weighting this towards foundational skills that they were taught? Like, you knew how to build this kind of circuit because you were taught to. You knew that you encountered this problem in your project and it was a way to solve it is to use this circuit. But I don't grade them on whether the project worked. So yeah, and I'm still revising the rubric, but that's a lot of thought went into it.
Yeah, great. For me, I said already, not having waste stuff that is dumped or whatever, but having value beyond the student and their experience themselves. So it's more exciting to me if something new, like if I don't know what's happening, it's like, oh great, cool, let's see what happens. I don't know, and so it's troubleshooting the whole way. So it's like super exciting and fun, and like I'm never bored during that at all. There is extra prep work at the beginning potentially, particularly if I'm seeing like, hey, there's 12 different options, like thinking of things. But as I'm perusing the literature just generally, I'm like, oh. Or I go to a conference, like, oh, that might. In fact, one project was one I went to a conference. I saw a talk. It was like an award-winning talk. It was like best paper of the year in this journal. And I talked to the speaker afterwards. Said, oh, that's like super cool chemistry. I bet we could do that in undergrad lab. So, oh, let's do this. So like, boom, collaboration. And so we published a JKM article on that after a couple of students tried that in a kind of CURE setting. And actually, those are only two. It was only those two students really? And then like, boom, next semester, let's do it in the lab. We actually did it online during COVID too, and published kind of both, how it worked virtually and how, obviously they didn't make chemicals in that case virtually, but they were able to analyze things and go deep on the green chemistry and the mechanism kind of stuff, which worked really well. So like that's been a reason for me, and it's super fun to see how they grow during it too, because the rate of growth, even if it's only like 5-6 weeks in the lab of doing that versus the rest of the semester, it's a really big change. It's a lot of fun.
Well, I think I mentioned in terms of why I started teaching at CURE, because that's how it's done here at Vosburg College at Hampshire. I think I continued to do it because I loved it and I could see the benefits to the students. Initially, I think fresh out of graduate school, I looked at students like they're, my little minions there to help me with my research that I'm trying to get published, or maybe making little mini-me's, but it didn't take too long before, I really started to recognize the uniqueness, the individuality that students can bring to CURE projects, that they can bring their own personal experiences and backgrounds, wherever they come from, whatever they've done, bring, in many cases, their own creativity and their own unique types of questions that they like to ask, and their own ways of thinking about things. And that, for me, was when I think light bulbs went off for me. It's like, wow, this can be really amazing. And what actually I think probably has ended up happening over the last 20 years is I've probably learned more from them than they have from me as a result of doing this, I think. I'm not sure, but that might be the case. And it's in part because of their curiosity, their interest. I've learned, I moved into areas of research in those 20 years that had not been areas of research I've been thinking about, but that because the students, 18-year-olds, are in touch with a culture, a life that I'm not in touch with. Definitely not right now. Very, very easily anyway, right? I mean, they're thinking about things and they're aware of things in a way that I'm not, and they're my conduit to the future, so to speak, right? Because they're looking at the future and I'm trying to figure out where they're headed. And so I've learned and moved into areas of research that I had no idea were going to be big things. Like I said, I'm a microbiologist. Like we were doing projects on yogurt and probiotics long before there were any publications in the leading microbiology journals on those things. I had no idea, but they knew. They knew that that was an interesting thing because they were in their sphere. They were talking about it and thinking about it, and so. Like I said, that's why I continue to do them, because I think it keeps me, thinking like a 19-year-old a little bit. I'm trying to hang on to that a little bit. In terms of I think you also asked about learning outcomes. Yeah. I probably undervalue content knowledge a little bit. I just don't pay attention to it very much. I'm really interested in skills. Can you find literature? How do you read it? Your quantitative skills, all those critical thinking skills. I just focus on those all the time. And over time, more and more collaborative skills, right? I mean, it seemed like 20 years ago we were talking a lot about, there's a lot of sort of this individuality, individual research skills and stuff, but it's somewhere in between we started realizing that, you need more collaborative skills. Scientists work together, right? We're not all mad scientists working in the basement alone. And so I started building in a lot of collaborative activities, working in teams. How do you work as part of a team? And that's turned out, obviously we see the world we live in now, but that I think is probably one of the most important things that I've included as part of my CURE. It's not science, but it's an essential skill, right? So we have these opportunities as a result of doing CUREs to build in these other things that students need as they go out into the world, and they can build on those things.
Yeah, so the first part of the question is why do it, right? So I think, how did I get started? Yeah, so I think as an undergraduate, I liked chemistry. That's why I decided to major in it. I didn't really know what chemists do or what research was. And I think part of it just connects to sort of my own background. I didn't really have anyone in my immediate community who was a scientist. I didn't really know what scientists do. And I just by accident ended up getting a research position just because of a friend of mine helping me out the summer before my junior year. And that was my first like lab experience. And that was like a pretty mind-blowing thing. That was like the point where I started to really love chemistry, is sort of seeing it in action and getting to do it. And so kind of my motivation in coming to an environment like this is you get to be the person who does that for people. So that's why my research lab is too big. But like ultimately you can only help so many students in your research lab. And so I wanted to think about how can I continue to scale this? How can I give more and more students exposure to that kind of experience that I had more or less by accident? And it haunts me. What would have happened if my friend's dad wasn't head of R&D at a pharmaceutical company? That was the only reason I got a job. And so it's bothered me my whole life. And so my whole sort of modus operandi is like to try to solve that problem. And I think this is a really, and so that was why I was like, I want my lab classes to mirror what I think is exciting and fun about research as much as possible. And so that's why I started doing it. And I think it's like it definitely happens. Like one of the biggest problems I have is when I did it with IBC with like first year students, like it was like 50 students and I had like 15 or 20 of them want to join my lab after, and you're just like, no, I can't do that. I got to like 7 and it was too many. But like, yeah, you know, I think it gives people like that first exposure. I think if that's your motivation, it absolutely works for that. I think in terms of learning objectives and like those kinds of things, I think kind of like similar to sort of Jason in that I think like technical skills are important, but there's some sort of balance between technical skills and like softer skills, and I think I value those softer skills more. I think that one of the things that is unique about a CURE that you can sort of do, and I think is a unique sort of learning objective that comes out of these, is I build a lot of repetition and troubleshooting into these by design. So it's like, you know, if you're going to do some cloning, like, you know, create some genes, you're probably going to have to do like a few rounds of PCR. And so you're going to do the first one, it's going to fail, and say, okay, how do we figure out how to troubleshoot this? And make them read things, come back with ideas, talk about it, and try again. And I think that was really built into the one that I was an undergraduate. And it was probably the most valuable experience for me was being a TA when I did as an undergraduate, because when I was the TA, I would help everyone troubleshoot. And so it was like a master class in troubleshooting where I would just run around between groups and try to help different people troubleshoot. And I realized to me that's the most important part of CURE is like active troubleshooting and learning through iteration of like how to adjust experiments and repeat. So I think that would be the only thing. I probably have like fewer technical skills gained, but more like soft skills, troubleshooting, those kind of things gained in terms of learning objectives.
Wonderful, thank you all so much. I have so many follow-up questions for each of you, but I really want to open it up to everyone else here too and make sure that your questions get answered. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to ask. Yeah.
I'm Katie Musicar at Pomona College, and I'm currently working on a CURE that will be a first-year chemistry experience. And so we're operating on an assumption that they have no prior experience at all. And so if I'm gathering right, I think 4 of you have upper division courses where you maybe could lean on prior prereqs. And so I'm wondering kind of how much are you able to lean on what they previously learned? And then in a first year, like how much scaffolding can I do, because the scaffolding may not be as discovery-based as I want, if I need to give them the skills to empower them to be discovery-based. So just like playing with that balance and lessons learned from that.
Here's a quick question, Katie. Is it an entire semester is all the CURE, or do you build up to the CURE with other stuff first?
We're going to do an entire year.
Okay.
And so I think I'm thinking the first semester might be more skill-based and the second semester will launch into the CURE.
Yeah, right.
And using those skills that they learned in the first part and repeating those, right? It's like we learn a set of 4 or 5 techniques in the first few weeks, and then they decide which of those techniques is the right one to address the question they want to ask. So they get that chance of repetition, they get that chance of mastering the skill. So yeah, you do have to build it still, even in upper division courses, the same as you will. But it's that reusing and figuring out how to mix and match. They have that creativity.
So I was going to say sort of like with any of these, I kind of feel like, so I think one of the things that I realized when I started thinking about doing it on my own, and I went back to the people who had taught me to do it, as, like when I was an undergraduate, was how much structure there was that I didn't see. And so I think a lot of like what makes these things work is like very invisible structure. So as a student, it seemed like we were going out in the world and it was wild. And then I realized when I go back, they're like, yeah, we cut off all these different avenues that you could have gone down that would have been a mess. And I think like when I've taught at the upper level, I think those guardrails are lighter. When I have done it with first years, and Jason has too. I think there's just more structure. Like it's just much more like limited in terms of what you ask them to do. But I think it's more doable than you think. A lot of worksheets where they like work through like answer this, now answer this, now answer this, and you help them like think through the process of experimental design. That's like very structured, but it's very doable. And how do you like share worksheets and stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I use that guardrail analogy as well. The interesting thing about the guardrails is they don't always know they're there. I do. I know, I'm kind of keeping them. I'm kind of moving them in this direction. They can't see them. They don't necessarily have that knowledge yet. And so it's nice for them. They can kind of move in a space. A research space, play with these new tools, these new toys. It's all very exciting being in the lab. But I know where the barriers are, I know where the edges are, I know where the problems are likely to go wrong, but for them it's still discovery, which is the nice thing. With first year students, yes, a lot more scaffolding. There's a lot more we do this technique, or I teach them a technique, and then they need to think about new ways of applying it, or a new situation in which I might have 4 or 5 ideas in mind about what they can do, but they may come up with some new ones, and that's really exciting, and we can do them. And if they don't, that's okay. I still have a couple of ideas that I can kind of plug them into. The originality of the research questions, first year students often are just not that sophisticated yet. Sometimes they are, and that's really great. So that scaffolding kind of needs to be there. As they get a little bit older, I tend to open it up. I've done cures where, it's research methods in microbiology is the class. I have no syllabus. I go in, and what are we going to do this semester is my first question, and they have to, basically tell me. But that doesn't work as well with first year students. I have ideas about ways I can do it with first year students, but it would be a mess. So that scaffolding, those guardrails, I think are important for you at least to keep in mind. They may not see them. They may not know they're there. It's still an active discovery.
Well, I just jump in and say that for me, I think about it as more of the guardrails I said, and yeah, I also think that way. For me, it's a balancing between how much class time I'm devoting to allow them to be free, and that has to match how wide the area is that they're allowed to roam. And so when they are younger, it's a tighter area, and by that I mean I teach them one technique maybe, and teach them technique so that they know if they did it right. So it's really important in terms of troubleshooting, right? Like, really their mastery is in them not only being able to apply technique, but them having the ability to sanity check themselves, right? And then as I do upper division classes, I might have them know several techniques, kind of like what Sara was saying, that they kind of have a toolkit now, and then the roaming area is these techniques added together.
Great question, Katie. Thank you. Are there other questions that you all have?
Yeah, I'll ask a question about evaluation, because with students doing all sorts of different independent things, I'm curious how assuming they need a grade at the end of the semester, how do you evaluate them all equitably? Because sometimes a research project, in spite of the students' great effort, maybe it doesn't pan out. And so just how do you do equitable evaluation in your CURE settings?
Well, okay, I guess I thought about this quite recently, actually. So this is in the context of my electronics lab, which is, again, it's more of a project thing. But I've had students continue their projects into a senior thesis, so it's very open-ended. What I try to do is I make sure that I'm evaluating the learning that was actually covered in the class in the scaffolding phase. So when I go around and I help them troubleshoot, which happens every class period during the month they're doing a project, I'm evaluating them on when they grab me over and say, can you help me with this? I'm evaluating the level of their problem-solving ability, what level of problem-solving was already done by the time they pull me over, right? And I'm also evaluating them based on they had to pitch their project. That's where I evaluate how much they were able to research the literature, have a good, deep enough understanding to plan a reasonable timeline. And I also evaluate, so for me, the softer skills I'm teaching is just time management. It's an individual project, but I also ask them to help their classmates, so there's some teamwork aspect to it as well. And that's mostly at grade, like a final presentation. So whether their project actually worked is not a part of the grade, but everything leading up to it is a part of the grade.
Yeah, for the diversity projects that I've supervised in this context, I would say about half of them work on average, like overall, it was a successful experiment. But it doesn't really matter. And I tell them that up front that, it's not unusual for it to not work. It's okay. But it's how they respond and what they do. Oh, why didn't it work? Let's think about it. What are some proposals? It might not have worked because of this or whatever. And how do you know it didn't work, right? So what did happen, right? So they can get as much out of that as they can from something that actually worked. Now, it doesn't necessarily lead to a thesis project in that case. It might be all right, let's not try that sort of thing again. And that's fine. That's useful to know. And we can move on and prioritize other things. So I think you can totally do it, in a presentation, in a report, in whatever. But to not emphasize your yield or whatever the product is of it, that isn't the measure of your quality as a chemist or scientist or whatever. That's not that, right?
Yeah, I don't focus on the outcome of the experiment. It is what it is. That's not, to me, what it's really about. It's the process. And so one of the things I really like to do that I think works really well at the beginning of the semester, I talk a lot about goals, and I have students write their goals for this semester. What do they want to get out of this experience? Out of the class. Okay, what do they want to do? I at that point have talked about my learning goals for the class, right? The instructor imposed goals, but I want them to set goals. I want them to have things in which they're thinking about and working towards that are not necessarily directly related to the goals I've set for the class. In some cases, an example could be make a friend, and that's fine with me. This is a shared experience, and building community, I think, is one of the best things cures do.
Make friends by cloning, is that
create a friend. Nowadays, with AI, it's getting really interesting. But, so I ask students to write their goals, and then at the end of the semester, I have them write a self-reflection, we call it self-evaluation, where they think back about their goals, they think about their learning for that semester, what did they do, what did they work on, what were they challenged by. I provide, I ask these questions, there's sort of a menu of things that they can reflect on. So I ask them to reflect on their learning. What was challenging and hard? How did you meet those challenges? And they usually come in at about a paragraph or something like that, and sometimes 2 pages or 5 pages. It all depends on how much that student wants to write. But I think an important thing to keep in mind about learning is that learning happens in reflection. It really happens in self-reflection. That is the key moment. When you think back, right? You can read a paragraph, but you don't really learn it until you've gone back and reflected on that paragraph. And I emphasize this with students, that they need to think about what they've done that semester, the nature of all their work, where they were at the beginning of the semester. And that self-reflection factors in a huge amount. Now, at Hampshire College, I didn't have to give letter grades. We had no letter grades. It was evaluations. I could take that and write an evaluation. Here I have to give grades, and so I just added one additional question. What grade did you earn in this class? We don't have to agree, and I tell them if we don't agree, then we'll have a conversation about it, but yeah, that, and they're usually harder on themselves than I am. So I think it's a useful question for them to ponder. That's how I learn.
One additional element I built into it too that hasn't been covered yet is the kind of dedication to the project.